Hello, and welcome to another day of free-to-play in Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. Today we are diving into deck building again. This is part 2 of the series. In part 1 we talked about colorless cards, in this case artifacts. In part 2 we're talking about lands. Now lands, I've heard some old advice from people before that if you spend all of your money on your mana base, you can make whatever deck you want. I have never found this to be true. People, have advised me in the past to spend my money on color fixing lands, the best rare lands that a format has. But for a new account, you get 10 2-color decks. You will get a place out of all of the slow lands right now from Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow, the Innistrad sets. Those lands come into play untapped after you have, your third land drop, as long as you have 2 or more other lands. You have 2 of each of those. Those are fine. Perfectly good. In addition to those, you have gain lands, right? Taps for 2 different colors, comes into play tapped, gains you 1 life. And if you play a lot of the jump-in events like I did, you'll also receive some of the lands that have entered the battlefield tapped, have 2 different basic land types, or for the domain decks in Dominaria United. In addition to those, there are also the tap lands from Streets of New Capenna. You can sacrifice them to draw a card. They tap for 2 different colors of mana. And as we'll see, there are more options even beyond that. So, I don't think you need to spend your rare and mythic wildcards fixing your mana. I think there are plenty of options that exist already to fix your mana. And if you watch part 1 of the series with colorless, a couple of the cards we picked up there will help you fix your mana and accelerate as well. And they can go into decks of any color. With all of that being said, there are still some lands that are worthy of your consideration. Now, my own count of wildcards is getting low, but I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I think if you have good colorless cards and you're very choosy about having good land cards, you will be able to build pretty much any deck you want. And from there, you need just a handful of colored and multicolor cards to fill out your collection. Alright, so Kamigawa has this cycle of legendary lands, 1 of every color. If you only play 1 copy in your deck, you never legend rule the lands. They're all as good as a basic land would be of that color, except for having the basic land type. You can also channel them, which means you discard them from your hand to do some kind of spell-like effect. All of them are good. All of them can easily replace 1 basic land in most decks. You might have a little bit of trouble fitting these into a 5-color deck. You want to have a few basics in case someone runs Field of Ruin or an effect like that. But outside of a 5-color deck, you should have space to run these lands. Aganjo is great. Already have a copy here. Otawara is the blue one. Takenuma, I'm also fortunate to have a copy of this. Might have gotten it from Jump In. Don't remember which packet. So Kinzen is the red one. Boseiju is the green one. Boseiju destroys artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land, and they get a card with a basic land type. So Kinzen makes a couple of colorless spirits with haste, They can also block if you do it in instant speed. Takenuma gets a creature or planeswalker back from your graveyard. You also mill 3 cards, so there's a chance you'll hit something even if there's not already a card in your graveyard. Odawara returns an artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to owner's hand. Notably, this would let you bounce a creature land, right? Because it doesn't say non-land permanent. And Iganjo deals 4 damage to an attacking or blocking creature. All of these effects do not count as casting a spell. Your opponent might be able to protect their creature with hexproof or phase it out, but they can't counterspell this. These are all great. Just having the 1 copy each of these legendary lands makes any deck you create better. So, I'm lucky to have 2 of them already. The other 3, I am going to spend 3 of my 12 remaining rare wild cards and craft them. It's because they count as both a spell and a land for just about any deck you build that has that color in it. Having a tool like that in your toolbox is just too valuable to ignore. Alright. So the common sphere lands from Phyrexia all will be 1. These all enter the battlefield tapped, make a mana of 1 color, and use that 2 mana of that color, tap, sacrifice to draw a card. They have the type sphere, which if you watch the colorless video, we can fetch these up with Monument to Perfection. Enough of these in play with enough basics and other lands will also let a Monument to Perfection transform, well, not transform, become a 9/9. Outside of Monument to Perfection, are these lands good enough to play? I think having at least 1 copy of each of these is a good option. And because they're commons, I'm not going to concern myself greatly about the wild cards that I'm spending. I can spare the commons. So, Fair Basilica, the Surgical Bay, the Dross Pits, the Autonomous Furnace, the Hunter Maze. Some of them I already have a copy of. I'm going to go ahead and craft the other 3. So I've opened 2 copies of Argoth. I don't know if you should craft this card if you're not playing Titania. There are other strategies that like to mill lands into your graveyard. Right, there's a Slogurk, that's a standard legal card. There's a 3-color legend, I forget his name. He's a 5/4 cat for 4 mana. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you put a land card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control tapped. You can discard lands to do different things. So if you had a deck like that using some of those cards, you might not even need Titania to go with Argoth. And Argoth does produce creature tokens. Unfortunately at sorcery speed. It also mills you. There are reasons that you would want this card in a deck that does not have Titania, but it only comes in untapped if you control a legendary green creature. It's a very good land, but I don't know if it's so good that you should spend 1 of your rare wildcards on it. If you know you want to brew with it, you probably won't be disappointed. But I'm not going to tell you to craft it. Alright, so if you were paying attention at the beginning of the video, I talked about color fixing. We have lots of color fixing lands. or I should say I do, and anyone who starts a new account gets the, unlocks all the new player decks, the starter decks. You're going to have these lands, the slow lands, 2 of each. You're going to have these gain lands that gain you life. Enter the battlefield tapped. If you play a lot of the jump-in events, like I did, you can get these cards like the New Capenna tap lands that draw you a card and sack, or the Dominaria United 2 basic land types tap lands. All of that is enough to fix your mana. Some people shy away from tap lands. It's all about sequencing. It's all about learning how to sequence your land plays and building your deck to take advantage of and be aware of your tap lands. Right, if you have a lot of tap lands in your deck, you might prioritize some 1-mana removal a little bit higher. That way, when you are getting to turn 2, if you have to do the sequence of turn 1 tap land, turn 2 tap land, which is not ideal. If that turn 1 tap land gives you access to a 1-mana removal spell, you haven't really lost much. Most people agree you can get away with a tap land on turn 1. You can get away with it on turn 2 as long as you've got a play. A good play. Or the green enchantment, Zeus's Many Journeys. You know, a really great sequence with that card is turn 1 tap land, turn 2 untapped land, like a forest. Zeus's Many Journeys, play your 3rd land drop, another tap land. And then when you untap on turn 3, you're ready to go. You've got at least 3 mana available, possibly 4 if you make an untapped land drop. Anyway, all of this is to say that tap lands are very serviceable. You should not be afraid of them. Just learn how to use them, how to sequence them. And as to whether or not you should craft these other color fixing cards, like this Cycle and Dominaria United, the Pain lands, these lands are good. They are good. If you open them, use them, right? While you're on a budget, early in your Magic career here on Arena, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You need spells more than you need these lands. You have lands. You don't need to spend your rare wildcards to fix this. So, Soldier Deck land. Application on this land is narrow, right? It's for the Soldier Deck. The Soldier Deck did not get a lot of new tricks in Phyrexia All Will Be One. If you already know and love the Soldier Deck and you know that you are going to build it, then by all means, go ahead and craft it. This is pretty much only for the Soldier Deck, though, so I'm not going to recommend you craft this. If you're wondering about the scene cut, I had a little blip in the power there. Fortunately, everything kept going. If you do jump in, you will get these lands over time. If not, they're just common cards to craft. If you need to go this deep into a 2-color pair with tap lands, go ahead, they're common. Same goes for these New Capenna lands. If you don't need Domain, then the Gain lands and the Sack Draw lands are better. If you do need Domain, then craft these. These draw a card effects are quite good. This is part of why I think the new spheres are going to be decent. Gives you a mana sink, something to do with your land drops late into a game. Any game that goes late enough, everyone eventually floods out. just kind of the way that Magic works. Unless you have an enormous amount of card draw or discard, sooner or later every deck floods out towards the end of the game. Anyway, so there are multiple variations of some of these, right? These gain lands have been in more than one set. All you need is 4 copies. 4 come with the account. These other ones, I think, came from the Jump In events. A little bit of a waste, but that's okay. So yeah, these slow lands, 2 of each. Alright, jumping back here a second. Hostile. I have tried to use this card. It's slow. It's sorcery speed. You know, if it was instant speed, this would be great. You could sacrifice creatures that were going to die anyway. As it is, it's very hard to use. Don't recommend crafting this. So the new dual lands, Phyrexia all will be 1. Same advice that I have with the Pain lands. They are great cards. You don't need to craft them. If you open them, use them. You probably know what I'm going to say here about the cycle from Streets of New Capenna. Now, the fact that you can cycle these, and that they make 3 colors of mana, makes these a little bit more valuable. I'm still not going to recommend that you craft these because rare wild cards are precious, but if you know you're going to do a 3-color deck, and these are the 3 colors of the deck, or if you're going to do a 4 or 5 color deck, I would not fault you at all for crafting some of these. They're very useful to have. Again, kind of like the sacrifice lands I mentioned earlier, the commons from Streets of New Capenna. These, because they cycle, have kind of a similar thing they can do in the late game for you, where you can trade your dead land draws for cards. They're very good, but I don't recommend crafting them. You can do just fine with the tap lands you've already got. Alright, Blast Zone. Blast Zone enters with 1 charge counter on it. I do not believe there's a way in Standard to currently remove that charge counter, so Blast Zone cannot deal with tokens. Now, in the colorless crafting guide, I mentioned the Filigree Silex, so if you have a copy of that, Filigree Silex can deal with tokens. You could double up on that kind of ratchet bomb-like effect with Blast Zone. It's a good card. It can go into any color of deck. Unfortunately, it only makes colorless mana. So a monocolor deck could get away with running all the way up to 4 of these. I don't know that you want to do that, though. It's a useful enough effect to have access to in the toolbox. I will recommend crafting 1 copy. These common fetch lands that fetch basics from Streets of New Capenna and gain you a life. These are good. Don't go out of your way to craft them. They're just commons, so if you want them, go ahead. They're very good in decks like I was mentioning Argoth earlier, so if you have Slogurk, you know, if you have the 5/4 cat, you can keep pulling these lands back out of your graveyard or the opponent's. So it can be a little bit of a liability to have this effect in your deck if your opponent's running that card. They're good. If you want them, go ahead and craft it. It's common. Crystal Grotto. I already have the one copy here. I may have opened it from a pack. I don't know if I got it from Jump In. I think having one copy of this card is great. You don't want to rely on this mana fixing effect too much in a 3, 4, 5 color deck because it costs you mana to do it. So it's like you've set yourself back a land drop if you're relying on this to fix your mana. Now, that being said, I think having one copy of this in a 3, 4, or 2 even, 2, 3, 4, 5 color deck is fine. Once in a while you will really need to have access to a mana of any color. Having a one-of effect of this in your deck is not too expensive. Furthermore, even a monocolor deck might want to run this card. A while back in Standard there was a card called Zhalfirin Void. I think all that card did is it tapped for colorless mana and it did a scry 1 when it entered the battlefield. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Crystal Grotto is a strictly better Zhalfirin Void. So a monocolor deck could run, 18 to 20 basic lands, 4 of this, and you've got some free scries. So you might possibly want more than one copy of this land, but I think one copy of it is just obvious. No reason not to. Demolition Field. So this is an update to Field of Ruin. We'll see that in a minute. Basically, the wording changed to where you can choose whether you want to fetch up a basic land, both the opponent and you. So you can choose not to shuffle your deck. Sometimes if you've scried up something to the top or something that's been put on top of your library, you might not want to shuffle. Whereas Field of Ruin forces a shuffle. I believe most people would say that Field of Ruin with the forced shuffle is the stronger card. Sometimes you want to force your opponent to shuffle, and you can play around shuffling yourself if you don't want to shuffle yourself. So Field of Ruin is probably the stronger card of the two. That being said, Field of Ruin might not get reprinted, which would mean that Field of Ruin would rotate. Looks like Midnight Hunt is the most recent printing of Field of Ruin. And if it didn't get reprinted, then Demolition Field would be what you have access to. So if you're concerned about losing access to your card, you could craft this one first. Secretly, between you and me, I think there could be at least a best of 3 deck, maybe not best of 1, but I think there could be a best of 3 deck that runs the full playset of Demolition Field and Field of Ruin. Runs, maybe a monocolor deck, so you never run out of basics to fetch with them. Pull these back from the graveyard, do a land destruction build. I don't know how the meta is going to shake out, but Esper has been a plague, and Grixis. Grixis, I think more so, on best of 3. I've been thinking about building a deck for it. I'll go ahead and give you the kernel of the idea. You make a land destruction build around these lands, right? It doesn't cost you hardly anything to put these in your deck as land destruction spells because they're lands. And if your opponent has, just 1 or 2 basics in their deck, or none, then you start just blowing up their lands. And you don't miss out on any, you keep fetching up more basics out of your deck. I think it could annoy the tar out of some people. I like the idea. Don't know if it would work, but now I've shared it with you. As to whether to craft it, it's an uncommon. Go ahead. Having one copy in your deck certainly not bad. Just make sure you have a couple of basics to fetch. That's the main thing. Most decks you go up against will have a target for it. If you're up against monocolor aggro, then as long as you're not running 4 copies of it, you won't flood out on colorless. Evolving Wilds you will receive with your account. Serviceable land. Use it if you need to. Once you have all of the dual lands unlocking the decks, you probably won't even need Evolving Wilds. Here's Field of Ruin. So, having one copy of each. So this is a kind of a niche thing I'm about to say here, but the Stone Brain exists in Standard. There are ways to, exile cards from your deck, choose a card name. So when you have a functional reprint like this, you can double up on the effect, but technically have a different card. And that means if they, use the Stone Brain naming Field of Ruin, you still have Demolition Field. This is one of the benefits that not having 4 copies of everything can do for you. Hall of Tagsin. I think I opened this card from a booster pack. So, most of what I said about Crystal Grotto applies to Hall of Tagsin. Now, Hall of Tagsin doesn't give you a scry. Instead, you can use it to make tapped Power Stones. Most decks can probably find a use for tapped Power Stones, some more than others. It's a good general purpose card. Rare wildcards are precious, and Crystal Grotto does a lot of the same thing that you need Hall of Tagsin for. I'm not going to recommend you craft Hall of Tagsin. It could go great into a Rakdos Anvil deck, or other artifact decks, but I'm not going to tell you to craft it. Mech Hanger's kind of a niche card, even though Reckoner Bankbuster is all over the place. The effects on this card are basically too narrow unless you have a vehicle deck. Mirrex. This is one of the new rare sphere lands from Phyrexia All Will Be One. Comes in untapped, makes colorless. The turn you play it, it makes a mana of any color. So you're potentially not missing out on color fixing. And it produces might tokens. They are artifact creatures, so like the Hall of Tagsin, could be useful for an artifact strategy. Being creatures, I think they are probably more valuable than the Power Stone tokens. Now they can't block, but they have Toxic 1, so they pressure the opponent more so than a normal 1/1. And they make good sacrifice fodder if you're doing an Aristocrats deck, something like that. Or if you're using cards that pump up the whole team. Wedding Announcement is one example. Then these mites could really threaten your foe. I think crafting one copy of this card is a clear and obvious thing to do. Should you craft two? I think that depends on how much you enjoy it. I can see a game state where you have 8 lands in play. You activate 2 Myrixes at the end of your opponent's turn. That seems like that could easily happen. I think the third copy is not necessary. I think it's fine. I think there would be no problem with having a third copy, but I don't think you need a third copy. So for now, I'm going to recommend crafting 1. I think crafting 2 would also be good. So let me go ahead and put my money where my mouth is. I'm running low on rare wildcards, but a copy of Blast Zone, copy of Myrix. These are getting spell effects into a deck of any color, while costing you very little in terms of deck building because they fit in with your mana base. They're great additions. Mishra's Foundry, if I did not have the 1 copy already that I'd opened from a booster pack, I would go ahead and say to craft it. Having a creature land to pressure your opponent with is a great thing to do. Myrix kind of does this effect as well. So, if you really like Myrix, if you really like the Might tokens, you might choose it over Mishra's Foundry. Mishra's Foundry, however, can block, and it will come up. So, I still say you should craft a copy. Fortunately, I already opened one. Plaza of Heroes. So this is kind of a must-have card for a particular legend deck that exists in Standard. I'm not going to recommend you craft this card. The reason why is because a lot of the spells that you would cast with this require rares and mythics. It's an incredibly expensive deck from the standpoint of wildcards or money to build. So even though the card is good, even though the deck is good, I don't think it is widely applicable enough for this crafting guide for a free-to-play account. So I'm going to say don't craft it. Alright, Roadside Reliquary. I think I got these from Jump In. If I had not, it's an uncommon, I would go ahead and say to craft 2 copies of this card. You don't want to flood out on colorless sources in a deck. There's only so many colorless lands you can run. But sacking this to draw 1 card is fine, right? Like those common sphere lands. You'll be happy to do it. If you manage to draw 2 cards, then this is amazing. It's uncommon wild cards. Go ahead and craft it. It's good. Alright, Secluded Courtyard. You choose a creature type. So, creature type decks, depending on how much support they have in the format, can be very expensive to build. Not necessarily as expensive as Plaza of Heroes, but to build a good creature type deck, often you'll have to dip into rares. It's kind of a hidden tax that you don't necessarily see with the card. If you find a strategy that uses a lot of common and uncommon creatures that share a creature type, you might be able to build a human deck with it. Then go ahead, it's just an uncommon. I won't tell you to go out of your way to craft it unless you find the right deck. If you have the right home for it, go ahead. Terramorphic Expanse is back. So, this... I would call it a functional reprint of Evolving Wilds. However, I've been playing Magic long enough to know that I think Terramorphic Expanse was the original. I believe this was the original, and Evolving Wilds came later. Right? Wasn't the first Terramorphic Expanse in Time Spiral block? Anyway. So, like I said about Evolving Wilds, usually you'll start finding lands that are better, so you don't end up needing the Evolving Wilds. If you don't need 4 Evolving Wilds, what do you need with Terramorphic Expanse? However, the Streets of New Capenna common lands that sack and find a basic of 1 of 3 types gain a life, those will rotate out eventually. And if there's a landfall strategy that comes up in Standard, there's a possibility you might want Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. Just be aware that it exists. Monumental Facade. It's a rare, obviously for an oil deck. If you love oil, then you know. You might think about crafting this. I'd probably go for the spells first. I don't recommend crafting this. Oil's an arrow strategy. And I want you to have the most tools possible for the most decks possible. Alright. The Mycosynth Gardens. This is a rare sphere. So like Crystal Grotto and Hall of Tagson, this is a colorless land that can also become a color fixer. It can also become a copy of a non-token artifact that you control. So that's great, right? That is a great ability. And for this particular crafting guide, I'm going to say that we want this effect, that we want 1 copy of this card. Again, you don't want to flood out on too much colorless and have to rely on this to make your colored mana. But 1 copy of this is not a big ask for a mana base. And being able to turn into a non-token artifact, if you watched part 1, where we go through colorless, and I talk about how colorless cards can go in any deck, and so we prioritize them first. That means if you crafted those cards like I did, you have non-token artifacts to target with this card. You have things to turn this into. Right? If you join me on that guide, this can become a copy of Monument to Perfection, Argentum Masticore, Staff of Completion, all these other cards that I talked about. You have them now in your collection. Let's craft this card to go with them. And if you crafted the one of Monument of Perfection, now you have another thing you can fetch up with it. And you're that much closer to being able to activate the second ability of Monument to Perfection. The Seed Core. This is another rare sphere. So the color fixing this does is only for Phyrexian creature spells. And it has a corrupted ability that's reminiscent of, I believe it's Pendlehaven. But it only works if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. So, it only color fixes Phyrexian creatures. It only does its, 1/1 pumping ability. If you get poison counters on the opponent, that makes this card narrow. And I don't want you to have to craft narrow cards. I want you to have cards that are good for a wide variety of decks, so you can have lots of fun as a deck builder. So, we're not going to craft the Seed Core. Alright, Thran Portal. This one's a color fixer. You've heard what I have to say about color fixing. I don't think this card is necessary, and I don't even sit across from this card very often. It always deals a damage to you. Like City of Brass. But sometimes it comes into play tapped, and doesn't make a mana of any color. Don't bother. Takazia's Dig Site. If I had not opened this in a booster pack, I would tell you to craft 2 copies of it. Just like I could see a scenario where you activate 2 copies of Mirrex in a turn, I can see a scenario where you activate 2 copies of Takazia's Dig Site in a turn. You might want cards in your graveyard, even if you don't. The first card that you see, you might not want, in which case, you can Surveil again. This is a great effect to have in your deck. Lands that function like spells are a great boon, a great tool to have in your toolbox. There's always a limit to how many colorless lands you can run in a deck, but you should have access to this one in case you want it. Some decks will want more graveyard interaction than others. Uncharted Haven. This is sort of like the strictly tap land version of Thran Portal. There have been other variants of this card, I believe, over time. It's just a common. You should have enough tap lands in your collection that you do not need this card. If you are making a 4-color or 5-color deck, there is a possibility you might consider running this card to be absolutely certain that you can hit a particular color. In which case, it's just a common, so no big deal if you choose to craft it. Alright, this brings us to our last card here. Voldaren Estate. So, it only color fixes for vampire spells. There are quite a few vampires in Standard. They're not just a fixture of Midnight Hunt and the Red Wedding, but it's still a narrow card. Right, if you don't have a vampire deck, it's a colorless land. So the ability to make a blood token is nice. That kind of puts it in the same region as Hall of Tagson and Mirrex, where it produces artifacts. Blood tokens can help smooth out your draws. They are also useful in anvil decks, things like that. 5 mana is a little bit much to pay for a blood token, though. If you don't have any vampires in your deck to make the effect cheaper, then probably you don't want it. And because it's a rare, I'm going to advise not to craft it. Alright, that brings us to the end of lands. So, when we pick this up next time, I'm going to start going through monocolor, and we're going to end with multicolor. Until then, stay cool.